Right, with the top being completely glued up, I trimmed the ends with the skill saw, and I didn't follow a straight line kind of on purpose. I figured with the live edges on the sides it would look kind of stupid if the end was perfectly square, so I just kind of freehanded it, and then I put an angle on the saw and cut the bottom edge. And these are my sawhorses. I put a 2x4 on top of each one, and I took my level and leveled them both ways and leveled them between the sawhorses, so they're shimmed up a little bit and they're screwed in place so they won't move. And then I slid the table over there. So the router sled is ready to go. This is as simple as operation as I can make it. I took my sawhorses and I extended the top with a 2x4, and I leveled it both ways, both side to side and from sawhorse to sawhorse, and fastened it securely. I just dropped the top on there, and the top has a little bit of a concave, so I glued a wedge on all four corners to make sure it doesn't rock while I'm working on it. Then I put a guide on each side. They're screwed to the end of the 2x4. They have to be above the piece you want to work on, but other than that there's nothing special about them. So I just came up an arbitrary amount, put a screw, put the level on it and leveled it, and then I leveled to the other side and did the same thing. And of course I cut my guide too short, so I had to add on, make it look funky. And then I made the sled, which is just a piece of that Home Depot shelf board ripped in half, because it's real uniform and real slick. On the end is this does two things. It keeps the spacing correct, and it keeps you from accidentally pushing it and having it fall off the guides, which would be terrible. And then these two pieces, this is pecan, something substantial. You don't want it to sag while you're routing, because then you'll be in trouble. So it's also good to have a space between your project and the guide rail, so sawdust has a place to go and you're not cutting into your rail every time you pull the router back towards you. So leave a little space. It's done, it's set, it's spaced up from my big router with this big bit, and we're gonna get started. Started out with the big router and a big bit, but the bit wasn't extremely sharp, and this white oak is very hard, so it was causing some issues. So I went back with the medium router and the straight bit, and even though it doesn't cut a very wide width, it's really sharp, so it cut really well. Started out making a shallow cut. I really need to cut all the way in the center of the table because the table has a concave to it. The edges are up higher, but I just maybe took half of what I needed to take. And I think at some point the bit dropped a little bit because I ended up taking a lot on the side, and I was kind of upset about it for a while, but it's going to be all right. In the beginning, I was kind of struggling with moving the router guide, but after a little while, I kind of got into a routine. I would actually bump the guide with the router and then lean against it with my hip, and it wouldn't move. So kind of got a pattern going, and ended up going over the whole table twice. And it came out flat. I removed an awful lot of stuff that I wasn't planning on, but it came out flat and it looks good. So the 50 grit belts on the belt sander pretty much erased all the router marks. Took a little while, and then I went to 80 grit with the belt sander, and then I went to 120 grit with the belt sander. And then I went to 150 grit with the random orbital. And then I went back with the 50 grit and rounded over the corners just because they were kind of sharp and got toddlers running around. And then it was time to get started on the finishing part. So the top is sanded down to 150 grit with the random orbital. And now I'm going to seal it with shellac. I like shellac because it dries quick and it's easy to sand. And the only purpose for this right now is when I fill all these holes with all these bug holes with tinted filler, I want to be able to sand it without staining the adjacent wood. So if I seal it, the stained filler won't stick so bad. It'll just make it easier to clean up. So this is shellac going on. Okay, we got a first coat of shellac. Probably put one more tomorrow. And again, the reason I'm doing this is because if I don't, when I squeegee filler in these little, you probably don't want to walk on that. When I squeegee the filler in all these little bug holes, it'll also go in the little recesses in the grain, and it'll be a bear to sand off. So I'm gonna seal it up real good before I fill up the bug holes. And if it was just bug holes, I would just use sawdust and varnish. But I've also got some structural splits and stuff, so I'll probably go with sawdust and epoxy, just to make sure we don't have any problems with it coming off later on. I sanded down the shellac with 120 grit, and I decided one coat's enough. I'm going to mix some epoxy, and unfortunately this is fast set epoxy. It's all I have, so I got to go kind of quick. I'm going to mix it with polyfiber, which will give it some bulk, and then I'm going to put some of the sawdust in it to give it some color.
My shaky hands are usually a liability, but when it comes to mixing up epoxy, they kick butt.
Polyfiber is just pure polyester. It's ground real fine. I use it a lot on boat stuff. And this is just sawdust from sanding the table. The sawdust makes it real dark real quick. Okay.
The epoxy was getting warm in the cup before I could just walk across the room. The stuff's so fast and it's so hot. So first thing I do is take a stick and get it out of the cup, kind of halfway spread it around. That kind of slows it down a little bit. And then we just fill holes. I ended up mixing 3 batches and did the whole top of the table, fill all the holes.
Okay, Sunday morning, all the epoxy's hard, ready for sanding. It's a little early. I'll wait till about 8 o'clock to start the sanding, and then we'll sand it all smooth.
Started out with the 120 grit belt and followed by the random orbital with the 150 grit paper, and in just a little while I switched to the 80 grit belt and then the 120 belt and then the random orbital. It's pretty mind-numbing work, and it goes real slow, but it will eventually all get off. After the sanding was finished, I wet the top with paint thinner. This kind of helps me see any scratches that I missed or any divots that I missed. It does the same thing as wetting it with water, but it doesn't raise the grain. And in a few minutes, it evaporates. So everything looked good. I think the top is finished and ready to flip.
So I turned my table over, and for the most part it's okay, but I had a couple of embarrassingly large cracks. So I got the router with a 1/4 inch bit, and I routed them out, and I set a piece of the white oak in there, hammered it in there. So as soon as the glue sets up a little bit, I'll plane them smooth. And there's some smaller holes that I can fill with epoxy, and then I will I'm not going to plane the bottom flat. I don't want to lose that much wood. I'll just deal with it when I'm fixing the legs to it. The bottom's kind of curved, and that's okay. And then we'll seal it up and flip it back over. There's a defect, and it's right on the end, and it's right where your thigh would be when you're scooting in and out of a chair. So I'm going to go ahead and route it out and put a patch on this defect. Now I've got a nice little square, and it's kind of tapered. It's skinnier at the back than the front. It should be no problem to cut a piece to fit in there and tap it in and put some glue on it. Okay, big step forward. I'm calling the bottom of the table finished, although I don't have a finish on it. I'll put something on it. I did a lot of it with the belt sander, and some of it with the power plane, and some of it actually with a disc sander. And my whole goal was to make it smooth enough where nobody will get like a run in their stockings or their socks hanging up if they're playing footsie with the bottom of the table. But other than that, it doesn't have to be smooth like the top. Okay, first coat of stain is on the bottom. It's just stain from a can, but it's thin 50% because that stuff always makes wood too dark. So this is 50% thinner and 50% stain, and it's still fairly dark. That's okay, that's the bottom. And I didn't put it on the edge. I was very careful not to stain the edge, because if I get some on the edge and then turn it over and then stain the top, it's going to look like a double stain. I'm getting ready to put varnish on it, but I'm going to be very careful not to get varnish on the edge. I'll even try to hold it back an inch or so from the edge, because I can catch that when I turn it over to do the top.
So with 2 coats of varnish on the bottom, I was ready to turn it over and start working on the top, but there were no available men around. They were all at work. And I said, well, I'll just do it myself. So I hooked up a come along to the ceiling, and I was going to pick it up and flop it over, but I ran out of headroom. And then I re-rigged it a little tighter, and that didn't work either. So then I was going to save headroom by using a rope with some pulleys, and almost took my fingers off when it got real tight and I couldn't set it down. So I ended up waiting. A neighbor came home, and we flipped it over so I could start working on the top. Now this is the top of the top, and it is sanded down to 220 and wiped clean, and now I'm applying stain. And again, I mixed the stain 50-50 with solvent just to kind of keep it under control. You can always go darker, but you can't go lighter. And because it's sanded so well, this stuff really went on real easy, no problems. Next day, first coat of varnish going on. I'm using floor varnish. I really like this for tabletops. I like the way it spreads and all the brush strokes disappear. And obviously it's hard. It's floor varnish. It's not worth a crap for vertical surfaces, so I use a different varnish for the legs. And I'm being bad here. I'm painting out of the can. I should have put the varnish in a cup so that I don't introduce dust back into the can every time you put the brush back in it. So this is bad practice you're watching me do.
Okay, the first coat of varnish is on. It dried all day, and I just sanded it with 320 grit, kind of whited it out, and I just wiped it down with solvent. That's why it looks wet. It's a little bit lighter than I was hoping for, so the next coat of varnish, I'm going to mix a little bit of some dark stain with it, and probably end up with 4 coats of varnish, so I can kind of play with them. Every layer I can get a little darker if I need to, and that's the benefit of not staining too dark from the get-go. You have some flexibility at the end. So this is the second coat of varnish, and I put some stain in it to try to darken it a little bit. It probably won't be very dramatic. No, it's not, and that's good. Okay, so far I have a coat of stain, some clear varnish, I sanded that, and now I have the tinted varnish, and I'm going to sand the tinted varnish, and I like the color right now, so I'm going to sand the tinted varnish, and if it doesn't lighten up much, I'll just go with 2 more coats of the clear varnish. So it's looking good. So we now have the stain, 1 coat of varnish with no stain in it, and 2 coats of varnish that were darkened with stain. Pretty happy with the color, so I just hit it with some 400 grit paper by hand, not with the machine, and I just wiped it down with some thinner. I'm going to put 1 more coat of the varnish with no stain, and then the last coat we'll probably do in the carport where there's a lot less dust, and I can hose the floor down and kind of control that dust. So getting ready to slop a coat on here real quick. Okay, getting close to anchoring the top down. I have two holes drilled in each one of these cross members. They're 12 inches apart, and I've got a screw that's going to come up through the bottom, and the screw is smaller than the hole, and I'm thinking that little bit of wood movement and the loose screws, I'm going to be okay. So that's 8 screws. I'm going to put one screw back on the end of this leg brace. I'm not going to use these two because these two would put some stress on the top when it shrinks, and it will shrink. But I think if I just use this hole, it can move a little bit. And then with my biscuit joiner, which is really a piece of junk, I've never been able to do a successful joint with it, I put one hole between each of these horizontals. It's just a biscuit hole, and I made these little clips. It's just a flat bar. I drilled a hole, and I welded a little piece of 1/2 inch square tube there. We'll shove these in there. It's pretty snug, but they go in, and we'll screw it to the bottom of the table, and then as the table shrinks, they'll be able to move. They shouldn't put any bad stresses on the table. So just waiting for a strong person to come wandering by, and we'll pick up the top and set it on there. It is pretty heavy.
You made it out of.
That oak tree that came from Stan's job?
We need another person? I mean Nicholas? I don't know.
Stand up straight, and then we gotta get under the bottom.
You're just going this way?
Yeah. Yeah. Alright. Let me straighten it out, screw it down tomorrow.
Ain't no way it'd be heavy when you get done.
Yeah. There we go.
Why you made it so big?
Because you got a big old place for a table.
How long is that thing?
9 feet.
You can put like 20 chairs?
Maybe put 3 comfortably, and then one on the
Tremendous.
ends. Pretty cool.
So this is oak?
Yeah, white oak. Most oak is red oak. This is white oak. This is that log. Remember that log they sent me? Big old freaking log?
Yeah. Who had that?
Came off of the Stan's job on SLA.
Okay.
It was dead. That's what it's all full of
You
locals.
could planed it.
I did.
You cut it and now you cut it this way.
They got it with a chainsaw mill like many years ago, and then it worked all up, so I had to rip it into smaller pieces.
Who chainsaw milled it?
Friend of Colin's brother.
That's a big ass table.
So the table will get fastened from underneath just to make sure all the fasteners work and have the right amount. And I'll put one more coat of varnish on the top and signing off on this project. Okay, the table is fastened. I got 2 screws in each of the cross members. I got 1 screw at the very end of the leg brace. Should move a little bit. And I have 6 of these little hold down screws I made, which are free to slide as the tabletop shrinks, because it will shrink. It is a law of nature. And I sanded it lightly with 400 grit, just by hand, and put the final coat of varnish on it. So everything's lovely. It's not quite dry. It's still like shiny in some spots and satin in other spots, but it should dry and mellow out. And this project is done. So yesterday I put on the absolutely final last coat of varnish on the table, and it was done and finished. And today I put another coat of varnish on the table. It just didn't come out good. It was kind of blotchy. I think I didn't stir the varnish well, and the flattening agents, which change it from gloss to semi-gloss, were not evenly spread. So I gave it a sand in and put another coat today, and this is the absolute final last coat of varnish. Table is done and may end up getting picked up tomorrow.